All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. My name is Karen Ruppel. I'm Program Coordinator for Great Horizons. Is this anybody's first time in a Great Horizons class? No, well, repeaters. How about that? You're spared the magnet spiel. I do have some brochures. I can leave these up here, and you can get more at your leisure if you'd like, because I'm coming back, so I can actually leave them here. Because obviously we have a lot of classes still coming up. We're going through almost to the end of May this time, so we can catch some of the snowbirds that are going to be coming back in May, you know. And how many of you have taken Joel before? Because he's been with us. Oh, look at you, have your repeat. Joel, you've been with us for how long? But I feel like it's
3 or 4 years.
At least.
Yeah. I love being taken, by the way.
So we've had the pleasure of having his company for the last couple of years, and I'm sure you're going to have pleasure when you hear his lecture today.
World premiere.
World premiere, yes. All right, so without further ado, take it away.
All right, thank you. So my name is Joel Farkas. This is my cell phone number, my email address, and also my website. And I give, of course, Revolutionary War lectures. I'm on my website or a list of my lectures. If you belong to a club, an organization, school, whatever, and would like me to come in and give a lecture, if you would contact me, all of my lectures are given free of charge. On the back table back there are some of my cards, and there's also a few more up here. I'm also a docent at Washington's headquarters, also called the Ford Mansion. I'm in Morristown. Behind Washington's headquarters is called the Visitor Center of the Museum. Everything is free now. There used to be a charge to go through the Ford Mansion. There no longer is. And in the Visitor Center, there's a brand new exhibit. It's called the History Learning Center. It's extremely, well, if you're my age, grandkid friendly. And again, everything is free. And by the way, if the front of the Visitor Center looks vaguely familiar, but you're not quite sure, the architect designed this after Mount Vernon. That's why. So, this lecture is entitled After the Revolutionary War, but we're going to go back a little bit first. This is North America in 1753, Great Britain, French territory, and this part in the middle around the Ohio River Valley, Pittsburgh, it's kind of both sides claimed it. So the colony of Virginia gets word that the French are building fortifications in that area, and they send some of their militia to tell the French to leave. That militia is led by a 21-year-old Major George Washington. The French do not leave. He comes back. The next year he goes back again in 1754. This time shots are fired, and those shots are what we consider the beginning of the French and Indian War. Now it's the French and their Indian allies fighting the British. That war eventually extends to Europe, where it lasts 7 more years, and in Europe is called the 7 Years' War. And in 1763, when it's all over, now this is the first map I showed you. This is now the Treaty of Paris of 1763. There's going to be a second Treaty of Paris. Now you can see what was French is now English. And also notice up here, Canada now becomes British. So the war is over and Britain wins, but in doing so, Britain has no money left in their treasury, so they start taxing the colonies, something that they'd never done before. This leads to no taxation without representation, more and more conflict. In 1775, at the Second Continental Congress, war is officially declared. George Washington becomes commander-in-chief. 1776, of course, we have our Declaration of Independence. All right, here's a little quiz. Where was the Declaration of Independence signed? Someone took my joke away. It's signed at the bottom. Don't ever do that again when I'm telling the joke. Anyway, the war continues until 1783, when we have the Second Treaty of Paris. So this is what North America was at 1763. 1783, you can see all the territory gained, and now the boundary with Canada is set. This is Benjamin West. Benjamin West was kind of the godfather of the painters of that time. He was born in Philadelphia. He moves to London. He becomes the official painter to the king. And he stayed in London all through the war. And after the war, he gets a commission to paint the peace treaty signing. It was actually called the preliminary peace treaty signing. And this is his painting. Notice it's not finished. The two British signers didn't want their pictures in this painting, so they show up, they sign, and they leave. Now, you see sitting down in the black coat is Benjamin Franklin. Standing, as you're looking at the screen to his left, is his grandson, William Temple Franklin, who was his personal secretary. This is William Franklin, Ben Franklin's son. William Franklin was the last colonial, meaning king-appointed governor of New Jersey. And when Ben Franklin comes back to support the revolution, he meets with his son, who refuses to change his allegiance. His son remains loyal to the crown, and Ben Franklin never talks to his son again. And Ben Franklin removes his son from his will. This is William Livingston, the first elected governor of New Jersey that our neighbor Livingston, New Jersey, is named after. Okay, Ben Franklin once said, don't put off until tomorrow what you can do today. Just kind of put that in the back of your mind. We're going to get back to that. So, the war is over, and George Washington meets with his officers to say farewell. He meets at Franz's Tavern in New York City. Franz's Tavern is still there. Washington says, with a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you. I most devoutly wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable. I think that is one of the greatest sentiments I know I've ever heard. So, from Franz's Tavern, Washington leaves, and King George says if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. Now, Benjamin West, the painter, told King George what George Washington was going to do. King George says this, what does Washington do? He resigns his commission, which is another way of saying he gives up power. And to a king, this is just unheard of. But Washington does that. Now, this is a painting by John Trumbull, who did a number of paintings that are hanging today in the dome of our Capitol building. I was there not too long ago, and I took this picture. So this is the picture that we're talking about. Now, notice something. Notice this light shining down on George Washington. It's like the sun is shining on him. Actually, it was the sun. It was morning, and the sun was coming in from a window. But I'm looking at that, and I'm going, is that a sign? Does that mean something? I just thought that was just, I don't know, wonderful. So this is that same scene in the form of an engraving. Now, I can tell by your eyes, some of you are saying, yeah, I have that at home somewhere, but I don't remember where. That is what's on the back of a $5,000 bill. I left mine at home, but you know. So, Washington is finally done, and he goes home to Little Hunting Creek Plantation. Isn't that Mount Vernon? Well, before it was called Mount Vernon, it was called Little Hunting Creek Plantation. The property had been in the Washington family since the 1690s. Eventually, Washington's older brother Lawrence inherits it, and he renames it Mount Vernon after his commanding officer while Lawrence was in the military, an Admiral Edward Vernon, and Washington left the name the same. So, This is our Constitution today. The document that establishes our national government. What the Constitution is. If you've ever read it, I don't mean the whole thing, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but if you read the beginning, the preamble, the very first words, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, a more perfect union, because we had an earlier union, we had an earlier constitution, the Articles of Confederation. This is our first constitution. 1776, Continental Congress appoints a committee to write a Declaration of Independence in case we needed it, and we did. And they also appoint a committee to draft a constitution for a union of the states. The states had been pretty much 13 sovereign countries practically. They had almost nothing to do with each other, and now they're being called upon to act together as a unit, especially in fighting the war. So they, after 4 years of debate, they finally agree on 13 articles which comprise our first government. I'm only going to read the first one. Establishes the name of the Confederation. We shall be the United States of America. That's how we came to be called the United States of America. It's in our first Constitution. Well, the Constitution was extremely weak. It gave our government very little power. No power to tax, no power to have a standing army, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So when the war is over, some things happen. One, the country goes into a deep depression with hyperinflation. Arguments start between the states, and every time the government is called upon to help solve these problems, the government says we can't do it. It's not in our Constitution. It's not in our articles. Well, this comes to a head with what's called Shays' Rebellion. Simple terms, farmers in western Massachusetts were having their farms foreclosed on them because they couldn't pay their debts. Couldn't pay their debts because they served in the war, so that they had no crops, and they weren't paid anyway. A former captain named Daniel Shay organizes a rebellion. The state of Massachusetts calls on the government to send an army to put down the rebellion. The government says we can't. It's not in our articles. Well, the state of Massachusetts raises their militia. The rebellion is broken up, but the point is this was like the last straw. So Congress realizes we need a stronger government. And so we have the Constitutional Convention. It was actually called the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. This is an artist version. George Washington agrees to be president of this convention. That's how important he felt it was. You see Ben Franklin sitting there. You see Alexander Hamilton talking in Ben Franklin's ear. If you look straight up, facing us is James Madison. So Congress goes into this convention with the idea of strengthening the Articles of Confederation, and they leave with a brand new constitution, i.e. a brand new government. And the man responsible for the most part was James Madison, who's called the father of our Constitution. By the way, Alexander Hamilton also played a big part in this. But one of the issues was there was nothing in our Constitution that actually spelled out certain individual rights and certain controls on government power. So James Madison pledges himself to go to all the 13 states, get their suggestions, and change the Constitution so that everyone is happy with it. And 2 years later, in 1791, he presents to Congress a number of changes, and 10 of these are ratified. Now, rather than change the actual Constitution, which would have meant another convention, and who knows what also might have happened from that, it was decided just to add these at the bottom of our Constitution. They're called amendments, and the first 10 are called our Bill of Rights. So where did the Bill of Rights come from in the first place? Even the idea of the Bill of Rights. Well, oh, by the way, the Bill of Rights, just to give you an example, number one, in terms of a personal freedom of speech and religion. Number 5, a government control, testifying against oneself in court. So one of the building blocks was the English Bill of Rights of 1689, but the beginning goes back to the Magna Carta. This is the first time where an English monarch agrees to certain individual rights. And conversely, that means he is no longer all-powerful. Well, 1215, the king was King John, who was the same King John in the movie Robin Hood. And isn't it amazing how King John resembles the actor Claude Rains? I just think that's absolutely fantastic. So, we have our new Constitution, and in it, it calls for a president and an election process. George Washington, of course, becomes our first president. This is an engraving of him being sworn in at Federal Hall in New York City. Now, the original building is no longer standing. This is Federal Hall today. If you've never been there, it is fantastic. It's run by the Park Service. And this statue out front, there's a close-up of it, is of George Washington, of course. So how did Washington become president? What was the electoral process? Well, today we call it the Electoral College. By the way, college does not mean higher education. It's just a word that means a number of people who are together for a common purpose. Back then, it was called the College of Electors. And without going into all the details, that's a future lecture, each elector got 2 votes. Both votes were for president. There was a difference between the first vote and the second vote, too long to go into now. The bottom line is whoever got the most votes was president, whoever got the second most votes was vice president. Forget political parties, they hadn't been established yet, but they were starting. In terms of federalists who wanted a strong central government, which conversely meant the individual states had less control. Then there were the anti-federalists, also called the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. They wanted to keep as much power at the state level and give this new federal government the minimum amount of power as possible. So Washington becomes elected president, and the question becomes what to call him. So here are some of these suggestions. Your Highness, Your Most Benign Highness, His Majesty the President, His Exalted Highness, but my favorite is John Adams, His Highness the President of the United States and Protector of the Rights of the same. Washington said, just call me Mr. President. So, in 1794, we have the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, I put Shays' Rebellion back up. Whiskey Rebellion, so we have our government. The government now has the power to tax. One of the early taxes was on whiskey. Now, farmers in western Pennsylvania grew corn, and their excess corn they converted to whiskey. So now all of a sudden they're being taxed, so they start a rebellion. A federal army is raised. Actually, Washington leads it. There is no fighting. The rebellion breaks up. The point is this. Shays' Rebellion, our government had no power to do anything about it. The Whiskey Rebellion, our government did have the power. I came across this engraving. I want to talk about this poor guy in the middle. First of all, he's riding the rail. Did you ever hear that expression? I don't know about you, but that looks like it hurts. Also, he is tarred and feathered. Now, the tar they used back then is not like the boiling hot asphalt that we use today. It was really pine tar. But at any rate, this guy's having a bad hair day. If any of you want to read a book of historical fiction based on this period, The Whiskey Rebels by David List is absolutely fantastic. I don't make any money doing this. It is a wonderful, wonderful book. Okay, in 1795, the painter Gilbert Stuart does a painting of George Washington. By the way, Gilbert Stuart trained under Benjamin West, that I mentioned way earlier, as did John Trumbull. So Martha likes this painting so much, she says to Gilbert Stuart, I will get the general to sit one more time. I want you to do this painting again, and when it's finished, you'll give it to me. Gilbert Stuart says, okay, starts this painting. Meanwhile, he's getting more and more requests for this painting. And each one is done by hand individually, and that normally would have meant George Washington has to sit in a chair for every one of these paintings, and we're talking 10 to 20 hours per painting. So Gilbert Stuart just never finishes the painting. So he never has to give it to Martha. He does over 70 more of these paintings. Today, this painting is shared between the Boston Museum of Fine Arts and the Smithsonian, if you ever want to see the original. And this is the image, although it's a mirror image, that's on a $1 bill. So Washington serves 2 terms, and he declines to run for a 3rd term, which is why, and I've seen this in many websites, the man who would not be king, because he could have been king. That's how popular he was. But after 2 terms, for various reasons, he decides not to run anymore, so we have to have another election. Now it's Vice President John Adams running against Thomas Jefferson. You've got 2 different ways of looking at our government, Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Adams wins by 3 votes. He becomes our president, and Jefferson becomes our vice president, right? 2 different ways of looking at our government, but that's the way the process was. And now people are thinking, maybe there's a better way of doing this, of electing our president and our vice president. Well, 1799, George Washington dies. Anybody know how he died? Okay. Huh? Thank you. That is exactly correct. You've been to one of my earlier lectures? Okay. I thought you looked familiar. Washington, without going through all the details, because I have more to go over, this is a painting of him on his deathbed. He had acute bacterial epiglottitis. Your epiglottis is this little flap in your throat. And when you swallow, the epiglottis closes over your windpipe, so food does not get down into your lungs. Well, Washington got this epiglottitis, and his epiglottis swelled, and it eventually cut off his windpipe, and he suffocated. That is technically what happened. The day before he died, he said to his doctors, bleed me. Bleeding goes back about 3,000 years, give or take, and the concept of bleeding is the human body is composed of 4 humors, think fluids. This is what the ancients felt. And you got sick because one of these 4 humors got out of balance with the other 3. And depending on what your symptoms were, that determined which of these 4 humors was out of balance. Well, over the centuries, blood became the one. And so it was felt if you bled the person and the bad blood came out, all the 4 humors would go back in balance. Well, of course, medically, it's nonsense. But doctors had nothing better to offer. You know, doctors were still bleeding people up to the mid-1850s. So the day before Washington died, they bled between 4 and 5 pints out of him. The human body has, on average, 10 pints. Think about that for a second. So now we have the election of 1800, and this was a game changer. We have the Democratic Republicans of Thomas Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, and we have the Federalists with John Adams and his running mate. Well, as I said, each elector got 2 votes. Each vote was for president, the second most votes, vice president. It was a little complicated. And when it was all said and done, Jefferson and Burr tied. And they each had more votes than John Adams. So Adams is gone. And then the question becomes, who becomes president? It's a tie. So it goes to Congress. It took Congress 36 votes to finally elect Thomas Jefferson. One of the people campaigning against Aaron Burr, was Alexander Hamilton. And we're going to get back to Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. Also in late 1800, the White House is ready to be occupied. Not great, but nonetheless it's ready. The first president to actually live in the White House, although it was a short period of time, was John Adams. In 1801, Benedict Arnold dies. Now, most people think of Benedict Arnold as a traitor, which he was. But in the beginning of the war, Benedict Arnold was a hero. He was almost the only officer who was winning anything. So there were 3 battles, and the question becomes how to acknowledge Benedict Arnold's part in these 3 battles. Now the first battle was the battle for Fort Ticonderoga. 2 people get the same idea to capture Fort Ticonderoga, independent of each other, at pretty much the same time. Benedict Arnold, and the other was a furniture store called Ethan Allen. They were successful, without going into all the details, how to commemorate this. This is a marker at Fort Ticonderoga. Benedict Arnold is not mentioned. They only mention Ethan Allen. Another battle is called Valcour Island. Washington says to Arnold, I need you to build a fleet of ships. The British are coming down from Canada, down Lake Champlain. We need to stop them. Arnold actually builds a fleet of ships, not these huge monster ships that the British had. Then he comes up with a strategy, and he winds up, even though he loses the battle, he delays the British long enough. Winter will fall, and winter is coming, and the British decide they have to get back up to Canada before all the water freezes over. So Arnold basically is the hero of Valcour Island, and here's a marker that actually mentions his name. The third one is called the Saratoga Campaign. It's actually comprised of 2 separate battles. And the real hero of this battle is also Benedict Arnold, or campaign is Benedict Arnold. This was a big, big victory. We captured the British, a British army of over 5,000 soldiers. And hold off for a second. And the importance, so the question becomes, how do we acknowledge Arnold in this victory? Do we or don't we? Now, in this campaign, Arnold was shot in his leg. And this is the same leg that he was shot in when he was trying to capture Quebec City. So to memorialize Arnold but not mention his name, if you go to Saratoga today, you will see a monument to Arnold's leg. And that's how they chose to remember Benedict Arnold's part in this very important victory. And the reason it was so important is that this is the victory that persuaded the French king to support the revolution. France had lost to Britain, right? The French and Indian War, 7 Years' War. The French king was reluctant to get involved fighting the British again, but now he sees that the revolution can succeed, that we can beat the British in a battle. Now the king is Louis XVI. His wife is Marie Antoinette. 2 things about Marie Antoinette. There's no historical evidence that she ever said, let them eat cake. None. There is, however, a medical condition that's called the Marie Antoinette syndrome. As the story goes, the night before she was to be guillotined, her hair overnight turned totally white. And it turns out that's a real medical condition. It's kind of rare, but it does happen on occasion. So it was called the Marie Antoinette syndrome. So Thomas Jefferson is now president. In 1802, he establishes the United States Military Academy at West Point. Today, we just call it West Point. But why do we call it West Point at all? Well, if you look at a map, it's on the western side of the Hudson River, and it's actually kind of like a point that extends into the river. That's why it's called West Point. I want to talk just a moment about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Slavery was a big issue throughout the forming of our country. It didn't start in like 1860 or something. And Thomas Jefferson's wife, her name was Martha, they had some children. Martha becomes ill and basically she's dying. And she makes Thomas promise not to remarry. Martha had a stepmother who was not nice to her, and she was afraid that if Thomas remarries, he might marry a woman who would not be nice to her children. And Thomas Jefferson never does remarry, but he does have relations with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. Now, here's the point. Martha, Jefferson's widow, and Sally Hemings were half sisters. They had the same father. From what I have read, there are no pictures of Sally Hemings, but from what I have read, she greatly resembled Martha Jefferson, the same father. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Joel?
Yes?
Wasn't there a paragraph in the Declaration of Independence abolishing slavery in the colonies?
There was,
and
and
that
it was taken out.
eliminated.
Yes, when Thomas Jefferson wrote the draft for the Declaration of Independence, about 30% of that draft was against slavery. But there was no way that the southern colonies certainly were going to ratify the Declaration. And it had to be 100% ratification, by the way. There was no way they were going to ratify it with this anti-slavery rhetoric, so it was taken out. Yes. Martha dies in 1802. Now Martha, don't want to go too long. Martha Washington, Martha's maiden name was Dandridge. She was born Martha Dandridge. At the age of 18, she marries Daniel Custis. Custis' family was a very wealthy old line Virginia family. Daniel was 20 years older than Martha. In 7 years, they had 4 children. I say 7 years because Daniel dies of a heart attack. And 2 years later, in 1759, Martha marries George. Now, by the time Martha marries George, 2 of her 4 children had already died. And by the time Martha dies, her other 2 had also already died. She outlives all 4 of her children. And one of her children gave her grandchildren. There was a boy and a girl. The boy is George Washington Parke Custis. He grows up, he has a family, and his daughter marries Robert E. Lee. If you ever go to Arlington National Cemetery and you look up on the hill, they call it the Arlington House. Many people call it the Custis Lee Mansion. 1803, the Louisiana Purchase. How did we come to buy this piece of land that doubles our size? Well, we have to thank Napoleon for that. Napoleon is now on his quest to conquer all of Europe. And you know, wars cost money. And Napoleon needed money. And he tried to reestablish a presence in North America, didn't work out, and said, you know what, I don't need this land, I need the money. So we send over some ministers, and they were given a mandate to offer up to $10 million. Napoleon says, give me 15, we're talking 4 cents an acre here. Give me 15, done. They said, you got it. And that's basically how we acquired all of that land. It was thanks to Napoleon. Okay, 1804, the duel. Let's do a little bit of a timeline to see how this all came to be. 1791, Aaron Burr wins a Senate seat, defeating Philip Schuyler, who was Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law. In 1800, we have that election that I told you about, where Hamilton campaigns against Burr in favor of Jefferson. Hamilton said Burr cannot be trusted, we don't know where he stands, etc. 1804, Burr learns that Jefferson is not going to ask him to be his running mate. So Burr decides to run for governor of New York. Hamilton campaigns against Burr, and Burr loses. Then in 1804, there was a letter where Hamilton is said to have said that Burr is despicable, and is a dangerous man, and so on and so forth. Well, this is the final straw, and Burr challenges Hamilton to a duel. Now, dueling, there was a strict code of dueling. It wasn't just a spur of the moment thing. There was all these rules, if you will. And rule number 16 says that the challenged, in this case Hamilton, gets to pick the weapons. Now, in 1801, 3 years earlier, one of Alexander Hamilton's sons was in a duel in Weehawken, New Jersey, and he was killed in that duel. So the pistols that Hamilton picks for his duel are the same pistols, one of which killed his son. They're called the Church pistols. You can actually see them today at the Chase Manhattan, J.P. Morgan Chase headquarters. So, of course, we have the duel, and Hamilton eventually dies. Whatever happens to Aaron Burr? What happened to Aaron Burr? Well, when they had this duel, he was vice president of the United States. So he leaves. He's wanted for murder. He leaves, and through connections, eventually the charges are dropped. Burr goes out west, all kinds of craziness associated with his name, and eventually he comes back to New York, and he resumes his law career. He's now like 70 years old at this point. Gets involved with a woman named Elizabeth Jamel, and he winds up marrying her. She was maybe the wealthiest widow in New York. And not too long after the marriage, she starts noticing her fortune is kind of disappearing on her. Seems as though Aaron Burr was using her money for whatever. So she files for divorce. Who is her lawyer? Alexander Hamilton Jr. And the day the divorce comes through, Aaron Burr dies. So if you want to see where Alexander Hamilton is buried, he's buried at Trinity Church in New York City. You want to see where Aaron Burr is buried, he's buried in Princeton, New Jersey. So I said earlier what Ben Franklin said, never put off until tomorrow what you can do today. Well, Aaron Burr had his own thought. He called that a maxim for sluggards. He felt, never do today what you can do as well tomorrow, because something may occur to make you regret your premature actions. Well, not to be outdone, Mark Twain says in so many words, forget these two guys, do it the day after tomorrow, just as well. So, some of you may know from earlier lectures, I collect autographs. These are all original signatures on various documents. I've got some of them I'm going to show you. This is my Alexander Hamilton. This is cut out from the end of a letter. This is Aaron Burr. This is a check from 1802. Ben Franklin. This is cut out from a letter. Thomas Jefferson with the seal. This is cut out from a land grant. I actually called up the University of Virginia to the research department to see if by some miracle they had the original document on their microfilm before this piece got cut out from it. And this is George Washington. This is an original signature that I own. And Benedict Arnold. Now, this is our Declaration of Independence, right? All the signatures. Look at the signature over here. That is a man named Button Gwinnett. So I started thinking one day, if he had a brother, would his brother be Zipper Gwinnett? Maybe he had a cousin, Velcro Gwinnett? So, Button Gwinnett was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was killed in a duel. He's still a very young man. And in the world of autograph collecting, Button Gwinnett is the holy grail of autographs. The last time one actually was auctioned, it went for almost $800,000. So I want to leave you with this thought. If you have nothing to do this weekend, go through all those old papers in a trunk in your attic or basement or something, and if you actually come across something that says Button Gwinnett, give me a call. I want to thank you all for coming. I hope to see you again.